boost hubs on mountain bikes have become commonplace over the past few years, and for the most part have gained widespread acceptance as the de facto standard for trail and enduro bikes, at least for the time being. But what's been discussed far less than boost hubs is the fact that boost cranks have quietly been messing around with new standards too. In this video, an explanation of what boost cranks are, why they exist, and whether you actually need them for your mountain bike with boost rear hub spacing. Okay, so to start, we need to define a few terms. Now, the over locknut dimension, or O.L.D, is the distance between the dropouts, and it defines the width of your rear hub. Now, it's called the over locknut dimension because older wheels with loose ball bearing hubs and bearing cones had locknuts that held everything together, and measuring locknut to locknut would define your hub spacing. Now, in 2023, most modern wheel sets use sealed cartridge bearings pressed into a fixed width hub, and so the O.L.D is simply the measurement between the inner surfaces of the dropouts. Now, not too long ago, the O.L.D for most rear hubs was 135 millimeters. Then recently, we went a little bit wider to 142 millimeters. Now, many, if not all, modern road and gravel bikes currently use this standard, but because mountain bikes continue to push boundaries and demand higher wheel stiffness and larger tire clearances, an even wider standard has recently been adopted and pushes the O.L.D to 148 millimeters, which is otherwise known as boost rear spacing. So whenever you hear the term boost for the rear hub, it just means an O.L.D of 148 millimeters. Then even more recently, the emergence of super boost has been gaining some acceptance on downhill bikes with an even wider O.L.D of 157 millimeters. So what does all this mean for cranks, and what is a boost crank set anyways? Well, to understand this, we also need to discuss another term, which is the chain line. Now, this term is often confused for the degree to which a chain gets skewed when at the extreme ends of the cassette, and you'll often hear phrases like, "Hey, you've got a bad chain line there," if someone happens to be cross-chaining. And while that usage may be appropriate to describe the chain in some situations, the actual definition for chain line is twofold. Now, the distance from the bike's center line to the center of the front chainring is referred to as the front chain line, typically measured in millimeters. And for the rear chain line, the measurement is from the center line of the bike to the midpoint of the cassette. Now, if the cassette has an odd number of gears, the chain line is measured to the middle cog on the cassette. And if the cassette has an even number of gears, the chain line is measured to the midpoint between the two middle cogs. Now, similarly for the front, if you're running 2x, the front chain line is measured to the midpoint between the two chain rings. And if you're still running 3x, no judgment, then it's measured to the middle chain ring. Anyways, the point of all this is that the chain line has two measurements, front and rear, and ideally these two values should match. Although anecdotally, it seems that practically speaking, a front chain line that's 2 to 3 millimeters greater than the rear works best for 1x systems. But what happens when the rear dropouts get pushed further and further apart is that the cassette starts getting pushed further and further outboard, increasing the rear chain line. Now, using the Kona Hanzo here as an example, I'm running a Microshift Advent X 10-speed rear cassette on a boost rear hub, which yields a 47 millimeter rear chain line. Now, the idea behind a boost crankset is to push the front chainring outboard a bit, just like the cassette, in order to more closely match the rear chain line. Now, to add some complexity to all this, different crank and chainring manufacturers use different techniques to adjust the front chain line. Now, for instance, SRAM systems, I believe, use a common crank to avoid having to increase the Q factor, which is the lateral spacing between pedal mounting faces, and it can achieve different chain lines by simply using offset chain rings. Now, Shimano, on the other hand, uses a common chain ring, but offers different cranksets to adjust the chain line. Now, for instance, the one that's installed here is the M7100 SLX crank, and it's got a stated chain line of 52 millimeters and a Q factor of 172 millimeters. While on the other hand, this M7120 crankset, advertised as a boost crankset by the way, has a stated chain line of 55 millimeters and a wider Q factor of 178 millimeters. Now, to achieve the larger chain line, this crankset actually employs a longer spindle, and to take up the extra slack on a standard width bottom bracket, you slide these little spacers onto each side of the spindle, effectively widening the bottom bracket. Now, it's a system that I've only recently started to understand, but I really have to give SRAM the nod here with their use of offset chain rings. It just makes more sense to me rather than having to buy a whole new crankset if you want to adjust your front chain line. Now, I totally understand that you can add a third-party offset chain ring to any one of the various Shimano cranksets, but that just seems like too many variables for a relatively simple application. Anyways, with the M7100 non-boost crankset that I have installed on the Hanzo, I am in fact measuring a front chain line of 52 millimeters and compared to the rear of 47, it's actually quite a good fit. Remember that you want the front chainline to be 2 to 3 millimeters larger than the rear for optimal shifting. So I suppose a truly optimal front chainline would be somewhere in the 49 to 50 millimeter range, but at that point I might actually start running into chain clearance issues, which I'll discuss in a minute. Now with this setup here, I've got no issues shifting all the way through the cassette, and the drivetrain rides really smooth even in the largest cog. So that left me wondering, why is the M7120 crankset labeled Boost when it seems so clearly unnecessary to push the front chainline out even further than it already is? And with the Boost crank, keep in mind that I'd have a front chainline of 55 millimeters, which is substantially larger than the 47 millimeter rear. Now this delta can definitely cause some shifting issues, especially when you're down in the really low gears. Now I'd imagine if someone were speccing parts for a custom bike, they might naturally assume that if you have a Boost rear hub, you should get some Boost cranks, which as it turns out may not actually be the best option. So it does seem a little bit complicated, but there are some instances where you might actually need the larger front chainline associated with the Boost crankset. And I think they mainly come down to real estate in the already congested bottom bracket area. Now, depending on the number of teeth on your front chainring, whether it's round or oval, the width of your rear tire, and the general spatial configuration of your rear chainstays, there may just not be enough chain clearance to run through all your gears without rubbing the frame or tire when in the largest rear cog. Now, if this is the case, the only option is really to just push that front chainring outboard a little bit, which can afford you a little bit more clearance, but again, at the expense of shift quality. Now, if you've ever experienced dropping a chain when trying to backpedal in the largest rear cog, that's basically what can happen if the front chainline is too large with respect to the rear. Now, unfortunately, when you're building a bike from the frame up, like I am with the Hanzo here, the only real way to determine whether you need a Boost crankset or not is to simply try both. Now, I could have just used the M7120 Boost crank from the start, and I would have been pretty certain that I'd have enough clearance for the chain in the bottom bracket area. But it turns out that the non-Boost crank, the SLX M7100, works just fine and actually offers a better front chainline with respect to the rear, with no clearance issues and presumably slightly better shifting, all without having to unnecessarily bump up the Q factor. So for this build, the right choice was actually the non-Boost crank, despite the rear Boost hub spacing. Go figure. All right, well, that's gonna do it for this one. But if you've made it this far, I actually wanna try some viewer Q&A. So if you have any questions about bikes or the channel or YouTube in general or my day job or whatever, just leave them down in the comments below and I'll pick some to answer at the end of the next video and hopefully, get some better viewer engagement. All right, well, that's really it now. Thanks again for watching. Thanks again for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you next time. Damn garbage trucks.